Tired of waiting for huge nations to put all the resources towards traveling into space? Ridiculous. Just build a rocket in your backyard. Professor Whelk's Trip to Mars by Terry Pratchett. Read by Karl. Professor Whelk's homemade rocket ship was rather too big to fit in his workshop, so half of it always had to stick out the door, or if it was raining it got wet. Well, he worked on the other half. Still wasn't sure the engines were working properly, so he spent most of his time tinkering about with them, lying on his back, with his feet poking out either side of the rocket and oil dripping down his sleeves. He didn't know it, but he was also lying in an oily puddle, so his bottom was very mucky as well. He knew about it soon enough when he went indoors and sat down. "What's all this, then?" said Mr. Brown, the man next door, leaning over the fence and scratching his head. Mr. Whelk still had a hammer in his mouth. "Oh, it's you," he said. He now removed the hammer. He crawled out of the oily puddle and picked up a saw. "It's a spaceship." "Really?" said Mr. Brown. "Going anywhere particular? I haven't held as this year either." "I just thought of going to Mars." "Never been to Mars." There was silence for a moment, interrupted only by a piece of broken rocket ship falling into a bucket. As the professor went into his workshop, Mr. Brown heard noises like someone turning on a rake and getting tangled in the hose pipe, which was quite likely, since Professor Whelk also kept his gardening tools there. Mr. Brown now began to get rather curious. The rocket was about 6 meters long, with 2 large wheels in the middle and a very tall chimney on top decorated with gold bands. There were curtains in the window, and the main entrance was a grand front door with a brass knocker. Once Mr. Whelk had pulled the rocket free of the shed and winched it upright so it was ready for takeoff, he opened a hatch at the back and put a few logs in. Soon there was a merry blaze going, and the big wheels inside the rocket began to spin, getting faster and faster. Whelk closed the hatch and screwed down the safety valves. "Steam-powered rocket, eh?" said Mr. Brown. "Want to come with me?" asked Professor Whelk. Mr. Brown now looked very curious, and very tempted. But eventually he said, "I better not. You'd to be getting back in to make dinner, and I get terribly travel sick, especially in space." "Oh, well, I'll send you a postcard," said Professor Whelk. He opened the heavy front door of the rocket ship with much puffing and wheezing. As he began to climb into the rocket, it rose very slowly from the ground, its wheels whizzing and whirring. "What about your air?" shouted Mr. Brown. "Won't be able to breathe in space without any air," he bellowed as the rocket began to rise above the apple tree. "My hair? It's all right. I brought a brush and comb with me," came Professor Whelk's answer, floating back over the breeze. "No, I meant air," shouted Mr. Brown. But the rocket was going faster and faster, and was soon well out of sight and sound. By the time Professor Whelk had got around to brewing himself a cup of tea, sitting in his armchair and turning on his TV, it was beginning to look quite circular. High above him, the stars were coming out, and the tiny ship was tucking towards it at about 6.5 miles an hour. "Hiss," went the radio next to Professor Whelk's armchair. "Donald Bank Observatory here," the voice said. "Is that Whelk?" "It is," said Professor Whelk, who was busy sewing some magnets onto his socks as he struggled to stay sitting in his chair. "There's no gravity in space, you see, and so people and objects tend to float about a lot more than they do on Earth, which can make going to the toilet surprisingly interesting." "What is your expedition?" went the radio. "I am present, floating on my back near the ceiling," Professor Whelk said. Indeed, he had by now begun to float to the top of the spaceship, passing the kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom on his way up. "Ah, that'll be because there's no gravity up there. I meant your position in space. How close are you to Mars?" By now, Professor Whelk had pushed himself away from the ceiling and was floating down again. The magnets on his socks stuck to the floor, and the professor was finally able to stay on the ground. He sat down at the control panel, which, because the rocket was steam-driven, was a mass of taps, pipes, valves, and cisterns, and peered through the telescope at Mars. It was still a long way off, so he pumped up a nice head of steam and increased speed to 5,000 miles per hour, just to make sure he got there in good time. Above the control panel was a list of things to do today. As he looked at it, the sugar bowl sailed lazily by and disappeared under the sink, leaving a little trail of sugar floating next to his head. Professor Whelk carefully turned the rocket round, and the line of sugar glided through the air and back into the bowl. Amazing, said Professor Whelk. Soon Mars was looming, and the rocket wheels were whizzing around as they tried to slow the machine down. "We really should have put in some sort of brake system," muttered the professor, holding onto the control panel and closing his eyes. A loud hissing noise from outside the rocket told Professor Whelk he was now entering Mars' atmosphere. Things started sliding off the shelves, and the floor was rapidly becoming the ceiling. The professor's half-drunk tea was floating through the air, and all the safety valves on the control panel blew all at once. Then suddenly the rocket was grinding and bouncing over the Martian sands with tremendous speed on its specially designed wheels. That was until it hit a rock and came to a very abrupt stop. "Yes, if there's one thing I should have put in," said a small and worried voice from underneath the pile of blankets, tea, sugar, and the very finest china mugs and plates, "it's brakes." Professor Whelk carefully maneuvered himself out of the rocket, which had left a big, long groove across the Martian desert. The sand was rust-colored and stretched away in all directions, as far as the eye could see, with a few unusual rocks here and there. The sky was still dark and covered with stars. There was a blue one and a silver one very close together. Professor Whelk realized with some amazement he was looking at the Earth and the Moon. "Well, well," said the professor. He put on a huge, old-fashioned diving suit. This is so he could breathe on Mars, of course, and adjusted his breathing tube before setting off. There was a large green patch on the horizon which he wanted to investigate. Professor Whelk's mode of transport was a bicycle. As he cycled off towards the green patch, the tire left a little track in the stand. Now, nearly everyone who gets to Mars in a story manages to discover a city. We know better now, of course. But this story was written at a time when the first rockets were going into space, and some still thought the moon was made of a very tasty cheese, so why wouldn't there be a city of Martians on Mars? And pretty soon Whelk was cycling down the main street of one. Large and interesting buildings loomed up on the other side. "Is there anybody here?" he shouted. "Is there anybody here?" came the echo. "Well, well," said Whelk. "Well, what?" said the echo. A little unnerved by this, Whelk pedaled to the city as fast as he could. His rocket had already left it, and there weren't even any footprints around it. Professor Whelk had sort of hoping there'd be some proper evidence of Martian life somewhere, such as footprints around his spaceship. "What an amazingly boring place this is," he thought. A few weeks later, Mr. Brown was planting potatoes when he heard a familiar puttering noise high above him. Very slowly, Professor Whelk's steam rocket floated down and landed on the soft earth outside his home, the shed. It was a bit battered and covered in red sand. "Back so soon?" said Mr. Brown, intrigued. "The Americans have just sent a rocket of their own up there." "Free cheers for them," grunted Whelk, pushing the rocket, well, half of it, back into his shed. Then they might be in for a bit of a surprise. This was because there didn't seem to be anyone living on Mars. Professor Whelk had bought a big sign before he left. It said, "I came this planet in the name of Professor Whelk." Then he added Whelk's planet. They added again, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." And to make triple sure, he wrote a final, "Keep off." Then he'd written, "Best wishes, Professor Whelk." Because whatever point you're trying to claim as yours and yours alone, it always pays to be polite. The end.